So a quick recap. At the beginning of chapter 4, he expands on his metaphor from the end of chapter 3 that the law was our school teacher. That is, the law was the school teacher for the people of God. Obviously, it was not given to Gentiles, it was given to Israel, but now, as he had said previously, all the people of God, including the Gentiles, are Israel and share in this history of the people of God because they've been baptized into Jesus Christ, who is the seed of Abraham that made all the other seeds of Abraham, the whole line of Israel leading up to him, that made them so important. And so when we were children, when the people of God were children, they were under the law. Just like an heir, somebody who is a rich man's son and stands to inherit the whole thing, is set under a slave, possibly, set under a tutor, as long as he's a kid, because he's got to learn, like any other kid does, he's got to learn the right thing to do, and he's got to be educated. But when the fullness of time comes, when the period of time that the father has set for his education is over, when he says, all right, you've learned, or if you haven't learned, there's no more hope for you, the period of education is done, it's time for you to come into your inheritance, then suddenly his status is changed like that. He inherits, and the tutor is now a past thing that hopefully has done a good job. The tutor is now a past thing that hopefully he will still respect, and hopefully he has internalized the teaching of, so that he will, on purpose and naturally, do those things, but no longer is it hanging over his head with the power to cane him, with the power to punish him, like a tutor had, like a teacher had in traditional societies where the PTA wasn't going to complain if the teachers were smacking the kids. And in just that way, when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who are under the law, that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of his Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. If you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then you're an heir through God. So this is how to regard the law. And I mentioned how the third use of the law is nicely understood in this way. You know, that it's the principles that you learned, that you now hopefully have internalized and will do naturally and willingly in your life because they are the right thing to do, rather than because you're going to get whacked if you don't. And it also sort of helps us understand what the fullness of time means. We quote that verse a lot of times without the whole context. When the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son. Well, the fullness of the time is, according to this analogy, the time at which God determined that the lesson had been learned well enough that it would stick. Obviously not for the whole nation of Israel, because large parts of the nation of Israel rejected and were hardened. And then the message went out to the Gentiles. But they had been brought to the point where there would be people who would recognize the Christ. There would be people who would turn to the Christ, and there would be the beginnings of the Christian church coming out of Israel, which then could spread to the rest of the world. And then we pointed out that the weak and worthless elementary principles of the world, or elements of the world, verse 9, now you've come to know God, or rather to be known by God, how can you turn back again to the weak and worthless elements of the world, whose slaves you want to be once more? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I am afraid I may have labored over you in vain. And that harkens back to verse 3. When we were children, we were enslaved to the elementary principles of the world, the elements of the world. And this is something that the Jews would have recognized very readily of the Gentiles. Yes, you've been enslaved to the elements of the world. You've worshipped idols. You've worshipped the sun and moon and stars, things that were created like you. You have worshipped as if they were gods. But Paul is saying, if you go back to circumcision now, if you go back to the keeping of the law and to keeping of the feasts that God himself instituted for the Israelites in the Old Testament, the Passover and the Feast of Booths and all the things that they were supposed to religiously keep on their calendar, if you do that as if that is how you are right with God, then you are under the elements of the world, Not in as bad a way as somebody who bows down to a stone idol, right? But it's still the same class of things, that the elements of the world, you are in bondage to them instead of having the liberty of the children of God. So for you, once you have accepted Christ, whether you come from the Jews or the Gentiles, once you've accepted Christ, if you go back to the law, you're going backwards. And you Gentiles who have come from paganism, if you go back to the law, you're headed back in the direction of paganism. I'm not saying you're going all the way there, but you're going away from the freedom of the children of God. And then he gets very personal in verse 12 and talks to them very tenderly and remembers how they received his message with such joy when he first gave it. And then compares himself to these teachers, these false teachers. They want to shut you out that you may make much of them. Meaning they want to exclude you from full participation in church. They want to shut you out like Peter did wrongly when I stood up to him when the group came from Jerusalem and suddenly he withdrew and stopped eating with you. They want to shut you out so that you'll clamor at the door to be let in. What do I have to do to be a full participant? Oh, you have to be circumcised. And now we come up to the example of Hagar and Sarah, or the allegory of Hagar and Sarah would be a better subheading there, starting at verse 21. But before we get into the new material, are there any reflections or questions on the review and what's gone before?
I missed last week. Did you discuss any, if you talk about third use of the law and you say you do these now because you want to, not because you feel like you're going to pay the penalty if you don't, does that apply to the Old Testament holy days and any of those types of things too? If someone willfully wanted to do those things,
we're going to get into that a little bit with, or I don't know if we're going to get there today, but the beginning of chapter 5 verse 2, Paul says, I, Paul, say to you, if you accept circumcision, Christ will be of no advantage to you. Right? And if you take that just by itself, make it stand alone, and it sounds like circumcision has gone from being the sign of the covenant to something that uniquely damns you, almost like it's the mark of the beast or something like that. But he's talking to Gentiles who are being implored to get right with God by being circumcised. And so the key is how you deal with the law. And we did talk a little bit last week about Messianic Jews, and how Paul himself, you have the examples we talked about back when we were talking about the first chapter, that Paul had Timothy circumcised, because Timothy was, he thought his ministry would be more productive that way because Timothy had a Jewish mother. But Titus, who was straight Gentile, he did not circumcise. And so it's not that circumcision by itself would cut you off from Christ, but why would you be circumcised if you already, if you're already if you already have Christ, and if you're not a Jew, like if it's an ethnic thing, then that's understood as long as you understand it as an ethnic thing and not as how you get right with God, and then say to the Gentiles, hey, apparently you're not right with God because you haven't done this yet. So, but for somebody to who didn't grow up that way, to say, I'm going to keep the feasts, I'm going to, I'm going to eat kosher, I'm going to do all these things like the Old Testament says. I expect you could do that just because you found it interesting or you wanted to be part of that community or something like that. But I think most people making the adjustments they would have to make in their life in order to do that, they would begin to valorize it as this is a better thing to do. This is a better way to live. This is, I'm being more scriptural and being truer to God.
Quickly becoming what we're trying to avoid.
Yeah, right. Mike.
Isn't it some sort of human nature. I mean, when we look at other religions, I mean, they're always trying to earn their salvation by acts. And that slogan you just said, that used to be a popular slogan back in the 60s or early 70s, getting right with God. There used to be billboards that say, get right with God, whatever that means. But it's the idea that you're doing something that is earning your salvation. I mean, that's kind of what you're doing here with the circumcision.
Yeah. On a best interpretation, get right with God would mean believe the gospel, because that is the only way you can be right with God. If you don't believe the gospel, then that's how you do it, because Christ has made you right with God. But yeah, obviously that can mean a lot more things and a lot in other contexts, and it is our natural assumption, because that's how your boss rewards you. You did well with that contract, so he gives you another one that's important. That's how your teachers rewarded you. That's how your parents reward you. That's how your playmates reward you. That's how things work in this life. You don't get something for nothing. You show yourself worthy, and then you get more responsibility. And so we naturally think that that's how we have to commend ourselves to God also. It's our natural assumption. And it has to be broken by the realization that God's law is the rock face we can't scale. We can't recommend ourselves to God that way. We only can accept the mercy that is to be had through Jesus. And then you can do recreational climbing, because third use of the law. All right. Shirley.
This has anything to, well, it has to do with what we're talking about, but I have wondered, when they removed the 10 Commandments from various places, courthouses, should we get real upset about that, or is it okay?
Well, it's upsetting in the sense that it's it's the religious heritage of this country being rolled back. And I understand why it's happening, and I have some sympathies with people who don't believe that and would rather not have the government, feel like the government was foisting it on them. But it means that we're not nearly the Christian nation that we once were, and that's sad. But having the 10 Commandments, it's a symbolic thing. What it symbolizes is what's sad. I don't know if having a 10 Commandments display or not having a 10 Commandments display is going to make that courthouse function in any more of a Christian way. I don't expect it would. But it's the symbolism.
So as a Christian, we should sort of be sad about it. The fact that they're taking away some of the heritage.
Yeah, well, sad that the heritage is eroded to the point where it's being actually dismantled. The monuments are being dismantled. But not despairing, because the true church, the true church has always been smaller than the huge Christian culture around it, right? And Christian culture is not always the friend of the true church, but it helps in a lot of ways that you wouldn't expect. People know they're supposed to go to church. People maybe don't give God any time most of their lives, but they have this constant cultural pressure, and eventually maybe it brings them back to church. And then the gospel gets them, really gets them in a way that it didn't have to, but it does. And maybe if it wasn't so much of a Christian culture and they didn't have so many people who are influencing them in that direction, it wouldn't have happened. So, Mike.
I got a story that I heard this morning. It was on the Lutheran Hour with Klaus. And I mean, it's upsetting when we lose this stuff like the 10 Commandments. I mean, but we also, that's like such nothing compared to what's going on now with the gay marriages and all that stuff. But he told a story and he said it was true. When Brezhnev died in the Soviet Union in the early 80s, he said George Bush went over as a vice president to his funeral, and he described how the Soviet Union was an atheistic country. And this was the most powerful man in the country, had disavowed Christianity his whole life. And that when Bush was in position at the funeral, when he was in the coffin, his widow went up, and the last motion she made was the sign of the cross that was still, even though that for whatever 60 or 70 years or 80 years that they had taken Christianity out of that country, that was still the one solace she had at the end. So it shows you how hard it is to destroy Christianity, I guess.
Yeah. Right. The church itself cannot be destroyed, but a culture, over enough time, a culture can certainly lose a lot of the influence.
But the Soviet Union now is going back towards church. I mean, so you're talking a short period of time in human history,
Right.
80 to 100 years.
Yeah, it can happen. Now, of course, we see some of the more traditional problems with church-state relations in Russia. Going back to Christianity doesn't necessarily mean they stop invading their neighbors.
But that's the common people.
What's that?
That's not the common people that are doing it. I mean, they're pushed by their government.
Right. Well, I'm just saying that's more the problem we've had throughout all of history, where you have an official Christian culture where a lot of the stuff that happens is very non-Christian, very not Christian, very not the way it should be. Instead of it's an aberration having an atheistic regime for a couple generations, trying to enforce that from the top down, and that was very artificial. Now that it's gone, it's sort of like, it seems like the church is back, but actually it was always there. But now we have the traditional problem that human beings are sinners and their structures are evil, even in Christian society. Jamie, would you read verse 21?
Tell me, you who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. But the son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. Now this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are 2 covenants. One is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Now Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. But the Jerusalem above is free, and she is our mother. For it is written, Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband.
All right, Hagar and Sarah. Interpreted allegorically. This is the only place in the New Testament where the word allegory appears. These things are an allegory, would be a straighter translation of what Paul says there. I think they go with the translation. Now, this may be interpreted allegorically in order to get away from one definition of allegory, which is one that replaces the historical truth with an allegorical truth. So, Origen, back in the 3rd century, who was very influential in the early church, but is not remembered as a church father because some of his doctrines went way beyond the pale, and he ended up being condemned by a later council. But he infamously said that sometimes the allegorical interpretation is the only one, from the Old Testament, and the literally it's not true. You just have to get the allegory out of it, and that's what the Holy Spirit is telling you. And so I expect that this translation, this may be interpreted allegorically, is meant to guard against that. And so we're clear that St. Paul isn't suggesting that the Hagar and Sarah thing never actually happened. But what he says is actually straight out, these things are an allegory. So back to verse 21. You who desire to be under the law, do you not listen to the law? Now, we don't think of this as law, what he's about to say, because he's recounting a historical episode and not statutes and commandments given by God. But it's from the book of Genesis, and the book of Genesis is the first book of the Torah, the law. The books of the law, Genesis is the first one of these, and so that's why he calls it the law. For it is written that Abraham had 2 sons, one by a slave woman and one by a free woman. So you remember the setup there. Abraham's been promised by God that he's going to have a son, and that not just one son, but that through him there's going to be this great nation and the seed by whom all the nations of the earth will be blessed. Right? That's the same promise that we've been talking about earlier. Abraham is living with this promise, but it hasn't happened yet, and he's gotten old, and Sarah's getting old, and he's starting to lose. He's starting to, maybe lose hope isn't the right. He has strong faith, but he's starting to think maybe the promise needs a little bit of help. Like God told me that I was gonna have a child, and I've been assuming it's gonna be through my wife, because she's the only woman that I could, but maybe I need to take a concubine so that this promise will happen. And it's actually, the way it's related in Genesis, it's something that Sarah suggests to him. It wasn't his idea. And so she gives him, as a concubine, her servant, her handmaiden, Hagar. And then he does actually have a son with Hagar, and that's Ishmael. And it seems like, okay, now I've got a seed by which the promise can come to pass. But then God comes to him again and says, through Sarah, your line shall be counted. And God basically says, you've tried by your own machinations to make this promise come true. I can handle that. And I'm going to do it the way I've always been planning to do it. I'm going to do it through Sarah. And we get here in the explanation that Paul gives us in the book of Galatians, we get some real insight into why that is. The son of the slave was born according to the flesh, while the son of the free woman was born through promise. What does that mean?
It was just what you just said. It was born because he did it on his own, and the other one was born through the promise of God.
Right. Because he did it on his own, and because it was the natural way for it to happen. Hagar was not barren. Hagar was apparently of childbearing age. Abraham was still, Abraham could still procreate. And that's not a miracle. You look at that and you say, well, yeah, that happens. That happens sometimes. Old guys can still have kids if they happen to be with a young enough woman. That's not a surprise. That's not a miracle. That's just nature. But when Isaac is born from Sarah, who's 90 years old, or 91 by that time, 90 or 91, I forget which, that is surprising. That is something that makes you sit up and say, God did that, especially since she's been barren her whole life long. Like they've been trying for a long time, and she never had a kid up to this point. And so this Isaac is clearly the son of the promise. He is born supernaturally, even though it happens through natural mechanisms. He is born supernaturally, whereas Ishmael is born just the normal way and the way that people can arrange, right? It's sort of like born not according to the will of a husband, but born according to the will of God. We got in John, I think it is, the idea that we are born from above. We're born supernaturally. We're not born by natural means. I'm talking about our spiritual rebirth. And so this may be interpreted allegorically. These women are two covenants, Old Covenant and a New Covenant. One is from Mount Sinai, the law given in Mount Sinai, the Ten Commandments, and everything that went along with the Ten Commandments. And this one bears children for slavery. These children are not the heirs. Ishmael was not the heir. Ishmael ends up disinherited, and Isaac only is the heir because he was the promise. He was the one who was supposed to receive the promise of God. So one is from Mount Sinai, bearing children for slavery. She is Hagar. Hagar is Mount Sinai in Arabia. She corresponds to the present Jerusalem, for she is in slavery with her children. So the present Jerusalem is geographical Jerusalem. The present Jerusalem is the capital and holy city of the Jews. And it's where the religious leaders, the leaders of the establishment that has rejected Jesus, still, in the time that Paul is writing this, still have their headquarters. And that is the earthly Jerusalem around which all of the promises made to Israel in the Old Testament seem to be bound. They're all connected to the land, right? When God finally gets fed up with their idolatrous ways, he kicks them out of the land. And then the great promise is you will be brought back to the land, and you'll be able to worship me in freedom and peace again. And the temple is the place where God dwells with his people and where he meets them. But now the place where God dwells with his people and meets them is the body of Christ. Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it again. And so we have Christ ascended into heaven. He is the Jerusalem above. The Jerusalem above is free. And you think of the book of Revelation, the holy city coming down from heaven to earth. So that is the Jerusalem that is above. That is representative of the church. That is Christ. That is the saints who have gone before us and the elect angels. And that is the free. That is the free line. That is the children of the free woman, the descendants of Isaac. In other words, Israel. True Israel is the Jerusalem above, and the Jerusalem below is still in bondage to the law. And so, which one, now that there is the Jerusalem above, which one do you want to be part of? You're already part of that one. Don't try to get in on this other club too. It's, at best, it's pointless. And then, he's about to talk about how, at worst, it's much worse than that. And then this quotation, "Rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. Break forth and cry aloud, you who are not in labor. For the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who has a husband." That's a quotation from Isaiah 54. It's the beginning of the chapter, and it comes right after the famous passage in Isaiah 53 about the suffering servant, about how he will... everything that he will do suffering for his people, and how God will bless him and many will be saved through him. Then rejoice, O barren one who does not bear. And the children of the desolate one will be more than those of the one who does not, or than those of the one who has a husband. And if you read through that prophecy, that chapter, it is specifically it seems to be talking about Israel according to the flesh, right? Because that's the natural referent for any Old Testament prophet. He's prophesying to the people of Israel. He's prophesying to the Jews. And so when he says the one who is desolate, the children of the desolate will be greater in number, they automatically, that's us. We're the children of the desolate one. We're the children of Sarah. We're the children who were born through the promise that God made to Abraham. We are the special race through which all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. That's us. But when you understand that Isaiah 53 is all about Jesus, the seed of Abraham, then you see that Isaiah 54 and the children of the desolate one and the ones who are going to be blessed and who are going to inherit the earth and are going to spread and multiply, that's not just the genetic stock of Abraham. That's not just the Jews. That is the ones, that is the church. That is the ones who are in Christ. And so he takes this verse and shows its true application in this context. Sarah is the barren one who rejoices because by grace she has all these children. And her children are the free children. Her children are the ones who inherit the promise. Her children are the Jerusalem above. Now you, brothers, like Isaac, are children of promise. He makes that connection explicit for us just so you can't miss it. You, and he's talking to Gentiles largely here, right? You, Gentiles, like Isaac, are children of promise. You're in. You inherited the promise just like Isaac did. But just as at that time he who was born according to the flesh persecuted him who was born according to the Spirit, and that's referring to the part of the story where Ishmael is jealous of the young Isaac when Isaac is born because he suspects that Isaac is a rival for his father's affections and inheritance, and he begins to mistreat him. So also it is now. That is, the church is being persecuted by the Jews, and this is something that happens a lot in the lifetime of Paul, and you can see other evidences of it in the New Testament. We've seen a few in our Revelation study in the letters to the churches on Wednesdays. That it's just happening again the way it happened then. This is what you expect Ishmael to do to Isaac. But what does the scripture say? Cast out the slave woman and her son, for the son of the slave woman shall not inherit with the son of the free woman. So, brothers, we are not children of the slave, but of the free woman. And that's an allusion to the part of that story where Hagar and Ishmael are sent away, basically, because there can be only one. There can be only one heir, and there's going to be rivalry, and there's going to be the heir who could be, the older one, is going to fight with the younger one if they're not sent away. And so God does bless Ishmael. Like, if you want to talk about the historical story, God blesses Ishmael also. He doesn't die in the wilderness, and the story is very clear about that. But Paul's not talking about that part of the story. He's focused on which one gets the inheritance. Which one is the son of the slave woman? Which one is the son of the free woman? Which one gets the inheritance and the promise?
I think there are some who interpret these scriptures in light of today's political situation, that the children of Ishmael are the Arabs, ISIS, the Muslim, and they're the ones that are persecuting the Jews and the Christians.
Well, that's not what Paul means, because he says, he says Hagar corresponds to the present Jerusalem. So, what he means is he's basically taking the story away from the Judaizers and saying that this is not about you and your precious genetic descent from Abraham. This is about the descent of faith through Abraham, which did follow the line of Israel, yes, but now it is revealed that it's for everybody. Anyone who's been baptized into Christ is part of this Israel. And so I think as somebody who is using the passage, I'm not suggesting you are one of these people, you're just talking about people you've heard do this, that they're missing what Paul is actually saying. And it's a common problem with dispensationalism, the dominant prophetic understanding of the Old Testament among American Christians is this premillennial dispensational thing that is just allergic to the idea that the church could be Israel. They call it replacement theology or displacement theology, like that Israel's been thrown onto the ash can, and they identify it with anti-Semitism and all these kind of things. When all that it is what Paul says so explicitly right here in Galatians 4. I had it's a conversation I had a lot with my father, because he was a dispensationalist and he was really into prophecy. And every time we talked about it, I ended up coming back to Galatians 4, because you can see it other places in the New Testament too. But it's just so clear here that what Israel is, what the seed of Abraham is, that Israel is, the church is Israel. Not in a sense that it's replaced Israel, but in a sense that the gates of Israel have been thrown open wide in Christ to all the nations, and all the nations have come in. And there are Jews in the church, there are Gentiles in the church, and probably lots of the Gentiles in the church have Jewish blood somewhere way back, because of eventually it doesn't become so important for the Jews to intermarry among themselves when they're Christians and they're with other Gentile Christians. And so it's not that Israel has been replaced, it's that the Jews who accepted Christ were the true Israel. And then the Gentiles came in and joined them. Mike.
So what you're saying is that Ishmael represents the church and that everybody's welcomed into the church?
Isaac.
Yeah. No, wait a minute. Ishmael, I thought you said represented Israel.
Yeah, Ishmael represents Israel according to the flesh, the Jerusalem that is below.
The real
the
Israel.
Jews that hadn't taken the
ethnic
Israel.
Like the church's, the Jewish establishment at the time.
Okay, so he represents the Jewish establishment, and the other one represents. Okay, I got you.
Yeah, right. And it's quite possible that Paul brings this up, this part of the story, in response to something he's heard that the Judaizers have been saying. And if the Judaizers were using this story, they would have been identifying the Gentiles with Ishmael. It's like you're kind of you're a son of Abraham, kind of, but you're not in the line of the promise. You're not really part of Israel unless you unless you accept circumcision and all the law and all that. So it's possible that he's taking this argument away from them in this way.
Who is the line of Ishmael? Now,
Basically the Arabs. That's Old Testament and the Quran both trace them back. Those races, the tribes that were the Arabs in Bible times, are traced back to Ishmael largely. I mean, obviously they can't be traced back just to him, but so therefore, in Islam, Ishmael is said to be the son of promise. So this is a really fascinating passage, and it is an allegorical interpretation, but it's not like a from the moon allegory. It's not like you have to say, well, it doesn't make any sense. It's completely arbitrary, but the apostle said it, so. Remember Paul, when he was writing to them, he wasn't the Apostle Paul, who every Christian on earth recognizes as an authority with the ability to speak for God. That's why he had to write this letter in the first place. He's writing this letter to people who are undermining his teaching and people who are going contrary to his teaching. He's writing this letter. In the first 2 chapters, he has to spend all this time establishing that he has the authority he says he has, and that he actually can speak independently as an apostle. So he can't just bring an allegory in that doesn't make any sense at all and say it stands because I say it stands. The allegory does make sense because when you remember the story, this Abraham, he figures the promise of God needs some help, right? I can help this promise come true. Maybe the reason it hasn't happened yet is because I'm supposed to do something, and that is the law. Right, that is the law. It comes from God, right? The promise came from God, and Abraham was trying to work with the promise. So the law, this is God's law. It does have a divine origin. It is a holy thing, but it lays constraints upon you. Do this, and you shall live. The one who does these things shall live by them. It's different from the promise. It's different from the gospel, and it means you have to toe the line, and you have to do certain things, and you have to do not just certain things, but all things, if you want to be blessed by it, if you want to be blessed through it, if you don't want to be condemned and slain by it. And so that really, that status of living under the law corresponds very well to the slave status. And the people who are still under the law, now that Christ has come, really are accepting that they are slaves. Because if they were heirs, they would have grown up by now, and they wouldn't be under the schoolmaster anymore. But if you stay under the schoolmaster, once you've attained maturity, then you're not a child going to school anymore. You're a slave. Because that is apparently going to be your status for the rest of your life, and you're not going to grow out of it. So if you're under the law, you do correspond to this attempt by Abraham to make the promise happen on his own, or to help it out, to do something to receive the promise from God. And the law for you, what you're saying when you go run back to circumcision and say we have to do all these things too, the law for you is not a schoolmaster, but actually a master. Mike.
What do current day Jews believe? I mean, do they believe that they're still under the law and they're waiting for the Messiah to come? They reject Jesus as being the Messiah, so they're still waiting for a Messiah to come.
The Orthodox Jews, yeah, the Hasidic Jews, there are a lot of synagogues that are not Orthodox.
What's a Hasidic Jew? What does that mean?
Well, I guess the Hasidic Jews are a specific group of Eastern Orthodox, Eastern European Orthodox Jews. And not all the Orthodox Jews would be Hasidic. But no, the ones who still believe, basically the modern-day successors of the Pharisees and of Judaism, who still believe that they are the chosen people of God and hold the Torah to be the divinely inspired word of God and still have messianic expectations in a traditional way we think of Jews having. A lot of synagogues actually belong to the Reform Judaism movement, so-called Reform, which is actually sort of liberal Judaism and corresponds to liberal Christianity in a lot of ways.
But they still think there's a Messiah coming, right?
I don't know.
I mean, the Hasidic one, I mean, the Orthodox.
The Orthodox Jews, yes, I believe so.
But is it a physical kingdom or is it spiritual?
I haven't looked into it a lot, and there might be different schools of thought, but my understanding is that they have literal physical expectation.
Do they still believe in an afterlife?
Probably, because the Pharisees did, and they end up being like the ancestors of Judaism. The Sadducees were the ones who didn't, but they didn't. Their influence wasn't carried on after the destruction of the temple.
Years and years ago, there was a guy who had been Jewish and became Lutheran as a result of a marriage, and he got it. And I thought he said that the thing that he was so depressing, and I don't know whether he was Reformed or Orthodox or what, but he said there was nothing to hope for, that this was it. Don't you remember him saying that? Do you remember that guy?
Who was this guy?
He was at Christ the King one time. It's been years and years ago.
The guy with the horn? The ram's horn? There was a guy who
I
came in
don't
one
know,
time,
might have
he
been.
had a ram's horn.
Shofar.
It was somebody who, I mean, he was a Jew turned Christian. Or,
Yeah, was he trying, yeah, did he get
might
up?
have, he might have, I don't
I
know.
don't
But
remember
he
saying
did
that.
get up and speak, but
Yeah, I remember the guy with the horn. He had a ram's horn, and he was showing us like what a,
we're impressed by different things.
well, I remember it.
This use of this allegory, though, would have been a big slam on to equate them with Ishmael as opposed to Isaac for those Judaizers. That would have been another reason maybe he used it specifically that way. It's like in your face. You're not who you think you are.
Yeah, it's very much that way because the Jews what did the Pharisees say to Jesus on an occasion? We are children of Abraham and have never been slaves to anyone. Jesus could have pointed out historically many times they've been slaves to somebody or other, but he just sort of cuts to the chase. But that is that story was very important to them, and they recognize, like if you follow the story of the patriarchs, the promise doesn't go to both of the sons. There's multiple sons, and the promise forks, right? You have Jacob and Esau, and the promise goes to Jacob. And you have Isaac and Ishmael. That was before Isaac and Ishmael, before Jacob and Esau, and the promise goes to Isaac. And then when you get to Jacob, then the promise goes to all of the 12 sons, and that's where it starts becoming a nation, and not just like a promise going through one line. But so it's important that you're in the line of promise, and not just Father Abraham, because Ishmael's from Father Abraham too. And so they make that a big part of their identity. And Paul's saying here, like you've missed the latest forking here. The promise goes through Christ. Now, Christ is the child of promise. Christ is the seed. The promise goes through Christ. And this does not limit it. No, this actually makes it much broader than it's ever been. This fulfills the initial promise. In your seed, all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. But if you insist on following the law instead, then it's like you went with Ishmael instead of Isaac, or with Esau instead of Jacob.
Paul's not trying to, he doesn't get into this much, but isn't this an example of people trying to do God's will and screwing it up? Or, I mean, Abram says, well, I don't guess that promise is going to happen unless I take some action in this. And it just kind of messes up the whole thing with it when he does that.
Mm-hmm.
Instead of having just the one line, he's got two lines.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's if you think about the story that he just sort of skips across the surface of here, that's one of the things you realize that the story means. Yeah, that God didn't need that help, and Abraham is better when he's just believing and God's counting it for righteousness. And so we are children of Abraham through faith. and not through what we do.
Nature, though, that we were talking about earlier is like, everybody has that tendency to think, well, we got to do something to help God's plan along because God can't do it on his own. So we need to do this or that. Instead of just going along with what God's plan is, maybe, and trying to fulfill that.
Right. And of course, we don't see the whole picture. So we're gonna fall into that. As far as we can see, if we don't do this thing, it's not going to happen. And so we go ahead and we step up and we do it, and we hope that God is working through us. But the key is to do it with the right mentality, that we are not God's only hope of getting this thing done. We are giving ourselves, we are offering ourselves to be the instruments through which He will do this thing if He wants to do it. If He's going to do it through me. Here I am, send me. And making yourself available and looking for opportunities to serve God without thinking of it as, boy, if we don't get our act in gear, God has no chance. The promise made to Abraham was a much more specific and personal promise, right? It was something he could have rested in without trying to machinations to make it happen. Because God had said, I'm going to give you a seed. I am going to multiply your seed. We don't have any promises that are that specific and personal to us, except for relating to, that we are going to be saved for all of eternity and forgiven. But as far as our daily lives and things that are going to happen here in this life, we haven't been told this thing is going to happen to you in this life. Just generalities that are true of the church generally, or of the world generally, but in your own specific case, that thing might not happen. In the world, you will have persecution. Well, we don't have much persecution at this time and place. I'm not going to object and say, what? Where's that persecution you promised? Give me that persecution. So we're sort of guessing, like, what, Lord, use me somehow. Show me somebody I can talk to. Show me something I can do. And we just try in our daily lives and in our vocations to live in a way that will please Him and in a way that will let our light so shine that men may see our good works and glorify our Father in heaven. And that's not what Abraham did with Hagar. But we can still... we can still run into thinking, man, if we don't do this or that, if this program doesn't work, if this church closes its doors, we can act like the whole plan of God has been unsettled, has been knocked off the track or something like that. Any individual church can close its doors, and most of the Christians will go to other churches, and the church will go on. And any one of us individuals, any one of our good plans that we have could come to naught, and God will still have His purposes accomplished.